So while the anti-smoking movement is awash with money, most of the groups that oppose them, and that includes many of the groups and the individuals in this room today, do not receive a penny from the tobacco industry and never have. The simple truth is that the only volunteers involved in the battle over smoking today are those in the smokers' rights movement. And yes, it's a David and Goliath struggle, but it's not the anti-smokers who are holding the sling and the stones. Just in closing, I should say that I'm not talking about the funding of the anti-smoking movement because I believe that a cause is any more noble or just because it is staffed by unpaid volunteers. I'm not saying that corporations should be forbidden from funding research or even delving into politics. I'm saying all this only to highlight the fact that there is a fundamental dishonesty about the way the anti-smoking movement operates in 2009. It is highly ironic that tobacco control campaigners are the ones who are using the tactics of their arch-enemies in the tobacco industry, as used in the past. Today it is the anti-smokers who are manufacturing the front groups. It is the anti-smokers who are perverting statistics and twisting science for their own ends. And it is they, not the people in this room, who are receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from one of the world's most powerful and rich industries. The funding is important, not just because it gets spent on lobbying, but because it gets spent on research. And the kind of research that gets spent on is research showing that smoking bans do not harm businesses. Research that shows that smoking bans cause heart attack rates to slash by 30–40%. Research that shows that third-hand smoke is fatal. This research arguably has more effect on the political process than the lobbying itself does. And in an ideal world, all scientific research would be funded by utterly impartial organisations which have no interest in anything but the truth. Of course, we understand that that can never be the case. We understand that if a company or a government or a pressure group is going to fund research, they're going to do it because they have a financial or an ideological reason to do so. I am not suggesting that the makers of alternative nicotine products should be barred from funding research, but then I'm not in favour of preventing the tobacco industry from funding research. I'm not in favour of barring any industry or any government from funding anything so long as it is done in an open manner. And it really is this lack of openness that most concerns me, both in the way the science is conducted and in the way the campaign for anti-smoking legislation is conducted. The use of front groups, the lack of accountability, the endemic misuse of statistics. All these are now so firmly rooted in the movement, and I would just like to offer two small suggestions as to how a little honesty might be injected. And I offer these fully in the knowledge that they will never happen. Firstly, the medical journals and the mainstream media should face the fact that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation owns tens of millions of shares in one of the world's biggest producers of alternative nicotine, and that this surely constitutes a clear conflict of interest when the Johnson Foundation is funding groups which are likely to increase the demand for their products. Similarly, the funding of anti-tobacco projects by Pfizer and Glaxo should be treated with the same scepticism as one might treat research funded by Philip Morris or British American Tobacco. And I say this not with a view to banning these companies from being involved, but with a view to making the scientific and political process more open. My second suggestion is that governments simply stop funding charities. The best charities do not require state funding, and for governments to set up and finance bogus charities in an attempt to manufacture a consensus degrades the very notion of charity to me. Any charity that accepts state funding is bound to be compromised by it, and any charity that is set up by the state in the first place is no more than another branch of government. The whole point of charity is obviously that it is voluntary. It should not require and does not require the input of government at all. Now, if the state stopped funding these anti-smoking charities, people would still be free to donate to them. And if, as the anti-smoking people maintain, these are popular causes, then they would have no problem. They would prosper from the donations of their supporters. The state, meanwhile, would remain free to continue carrying out anti-smoking projects. It would just have to do so using its own departments and its own committees. It might not even change very much, but again, there would be an element of openness and an element of honesty. Because I believe that the threat is very real, and the events of last week in the run to this conference gave us a prime example of what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of too few people. The Smoke-Free Partnership which lobbied to have this conference banned, is about as unaccountable a charity as you can imagine. And the EU is about as big a government as you can imagine. Last week, these two entities joined forces, and that is really why we're sat here and not sat down the road. That the EU is financially corrupt is a matter of public record. But its behaviour last week reminded us it is also morally corrupt. It is fundamentally undemocratic. It seems to be instinctively opposed to free speech, and it is scared by even the smallest hint of a debate. What I've been trying to illustrate today is that the anti-smoking movement, yes, it's run by well-paid bureaucrats, politicians, lobbyists, and ideological extremists. And not only have they lost touch with real people, but they seem to believe themselves to be unaccountable and untouchable. They can do whatever they please. And if you're in any doubt about that, then the fact that you're sitting here and not down the road should put that beyond question. Thank you very much.